And we're very excited today to welcome Steve Bloom, the CEO of the Portland, Japan Garden. I think without question, the best Japanese garden in the United States. I had an opportunity to visit the garden earlier this year when I was in Portland and stopped by to say hello. And everything okay? Got it. Okay. And had a lovely tour of the garden, and at that time said, if you ever find yourself in the Bay Area, we would love to have a chance to introduce you to some of our audience and people here. And so Steve has been the CEO of the Portland, Japan Garden since 2003, I believe. 2005, okay. And has done an amazing job, building it into a real, not only an amazing example of Japanese garden, an amazing Japanese garden, but a real cultural institution in Portland, Northwestern United States, and even beyond, has become known very well throughout the United States and internationally. And so we're very excited to have Steve here today to tell us a bit about the garden and some of the things that he's working on with a new entity, the Japan Institute, that he has set up and is currently helping to create the plan for. So let's welcome Steve. He's going to give a presentation for about 45 minutes, and we'll have a chance to do some Q&A after he finishes his remarks. So thank you, everybody. We'll welcome other people into the room here. Please grab a chair so you can kind of come in and say hello. All right. Well, thank you. We'll let you go ahead and we'll get started with today's program.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Can everyone hear me okay? Sound is good? Thumbs up at home? Yeah? Okay, great, good. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I wanted to take some time to give a little bit about the history of the garden. We are this year celebrating our 60th anniversary, which, as you know, in Japan is the most important of your birthdays. We just got off of our 60th anniversary gala this past Saturday that was in Portland, where we had people come from all over the world to celebrate the garden and the work that we're doing. And then talk a little bit about what's happening in the past and a little bit of the present, and then what we have planned for the future here. So, and along the way, show a few nice images of the garden. So just to get started with a little bit of history, the garden was started in 1963. I should say they broke ground in 1963, and the idea came out of the creation of Portland and Sapporo as sister cities in 1959. And so it was actually through the Japan American Society of Oregon that this idea of building a garden came, and took a few years to get enough interest from the powers that be. But the mayor of Portland at that time and a group of community leaders decided that they wanted to build this garden and thought that it could be a cultural bridge after the war between the US and Japan. In fact, Portland was the first sister city or friendship garden built in North America after the war, and there were hundreds that were built after it, with Portland kind of as the model for coming together through these gardens. So there are now about 300 public Japanese gardens in North America. And so Portland is not alone in the work that we do. So in the very early years of the garden, the gentleman there on the right is Professor Takuma Tono. He was the designer of the garden, and he is from Tokyo Agriculture University, originally from Hokkaido, Japan, which is where Sapporo is, as many of you know. And then he went and studied at Cornell University in New York, landscape architecture. So he was educated at Hokkaido University on the Japan side, and then went to New York to be educated in the US. So he spoke English and Japanese. And over time, he became an expert on American landscape architecture in Japan and vice versa. Here in the United States, he was an expert on Japanese gardens and Japanese landscapes. So starting his career designing gardens in Midland, Michigan for the Dow family, who were the founders of Dow Chemicals at that time. Also in Delaware Park in Buffalo, New York. He also designed a garden at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden that was a replica of Ryoanji, that does not still exist today. It was since torn out. But he was designing smaller gardens on a smaller scale early on in his career. It was then in the early 1960s that the city of Portland approached him to design the Portland Japanese Garden. And in fact, I think it was, well, we know now that it was the masterpiece of his whole life. It came to be. It was originally designed to have 5 different garden styles so that it was a museum of gardens so that you could learn. It was like coming to a classroom and learning about 5 different kinds of gardens. So if you were to go to Kyoto, for example, mostly you would need to go to 5 different locations within Kyoto to see all the different kinds of gardens that we have at the Portland Japanese Garden. Since that time, we'll fast forward a little bit. With the expansion we did in 2017, we added 3 more garden styles. So we actually have 8 different kinds of Japanese gardens that you can see all in one place in Portland. So it's a living museum of gardens. So the gentleman on the left was a gentleman by the name of Kinya Hira. Hira-san was a student of Professor Tono's at Tokyo Nodai, where he was then teaching. And he was the first in line of an original 8 garden directors who came over from Tokyo, from Japan, to live in Portland, and their job was to oversee the construction and the maintenance of the garden. And this is where Portland, right from the very beginning, there were a couple of reasons for the garden's success, right from the very start. One was the city decided that from the beginning that this would be a separate nonprofit organization, that it would be community run, community supported, that it wasn't just going to be a department of the city, of city parks. Because we all know what happens when budgets are cut in cities. What's the first thing to get cut? Culture, art, and parks, right? So Mayor Schrunk, right from the very beginning, said we're going to set up a private board of directors whose job it is to provide the resources it will take to support this garden, not just today, but into the future. The second was the incredible design of the garden. It was the integration of Japanese garden design, traditional Japanese garden design, but also integrating it into the Pacific Northwest. And so if you come to Portland and you see the garden, it's not just a flat garden that you might see in Japan where you stroll around the garden, but it is in the magnificent West Hills of Portland, right next to downtown Portland, and with all the old growth Douglas fir trees that are still there. So the designer could have said, we want a flat site for this garden, but he didn't. He found this site of what used to be the Washington Park Zoo, which had gone defunct in the late 1950s. And he said, we want the hills. And then there were all these old growth trees, and we could have said, no, we want trees that are of human scale, which is typical design element of Japanese gardens. But he said, no, we're going to keep these towering cedar trees and Douglas fir trees, and we're going to integrate our Japanese garden design into that. So it was these design elements of the garden also that was kind of the second thing that had been keys to the success of the garden over time. The third thing was this gentleman here, Kinya Hira, and the gentleman that followed him over a course of 30 years. And so it was what we call now the garden director system, which is very famous in the Japanese garden world, in that we wanted to make sure that the garden was authentic, authentically designed and authentically constructed and authentically maintained. So every 3, 4, 5 years, a native Japanese gardener was selected, usually a student of Professor Tono's from Tokyo Agriculture University, and then they were sent over to Portland to live and to oversee the build and maintenance and design of this garden. So I use the phrase lightly, it was not a Japanesey garden, but in fact, it was an authentic Japanese garden. And I think often when you see Japanese gardens in North America, depending on the climate, depending on the resources they have, depending on the maintenance, number one, it feels kind of Japanesey, but it's not really authentically Japanese. But number two, the maintenance is probably really bad on some of those gardens because they don't have native Japanese or Japanese trained or people who are trained in the traditional maintenance skills of Japanese gardens. So this gentleman, it was his job to make sure that the garden was built out. And then there were 7 other after them that came. When I arrived at the garden in 2005, it had been, a decade or more since the garden had had one of those garden directors because of money and because of visa issues. And so committees were making design decisions about the garden, and they had run into a little bit of trouble from that standpoint. And when they hired me, I was like, well, I hope you didn't hire me for that because that's not my skill set. You hired me as a manager. So I came back to them, I said, let's reinstitute this garden director system. But instead of calling them garden directors, I want to call them garden curators. Because in fact, we wanted to start positioning Japanese gardens not just as a place, but as a living, breathing, growing, evolving work of art. So we were the first organization out in the US and North America, if not the world, to, instead of calling them a garden director or a gardener or a master gardener, to call them the garden curators. And in fact, they continue to curate our gardens. So in the beginning, it was not a very easy, smooth road for our first garden director, Kinya Hira. And this actually drawing that you see here was done by Hira-san himself in this last year. So in the beginning, there was still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the community in Portland. And in fact, there was a large number of the community did not want this garden in their community. And they would come and there would be protests and demonstrations at the garden.
What year was that?
This is 1963. Yep. 1963, in the early 60s through the 60s. Hira-san was there for 5 years. And so in fact, here you see he depicts Professor Tono not wearing a helmet and Hira-san himself wearing a helmet while they're being stoned by the crowd. He lived in a trailer on the site where the garden was being built. And during the demonstrations or at night, they would come, the crowd would come and people would come and they would spray paint "Go Home Jap" on the side of his trailer. And in fact, at one point during one demonstration, he was attacked by the crowd and he was stabbed and almost died. So there was really, it was a different time in America, certainly. And they would scream, "You killed our fathers, you killed our sons, you killed our brothers, go home, Jap, we don't want this garden here." And this went on through the first couple of years of the garden being built. And he persevered. And I will say that he left the garden. He left the garden in 1967, really vowing that he would never return to Portland, that he had had such a bad experience there. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in my presentation. So over time and through these gardens, the garden began to grow. And it began to settle in. And we went from what was the site of this zoo in the past to what became the most authentic Japanese garden in the world. And of course, in the Pacific Northwest, it rains a lot. And so the garden itself, the plants, grew with such swiftness that suddenly this garden that they just planted was feeling like it had the age of gardens that were in Japan that were hundreds of years old, which is pretty remarkable. So I'll show you some of the transitions, the transformations, I should say, that have happened over the course of the years of the garden. So the next series of slides I'm going to show you are actually before and after pictures. These are actually the spot that was at the garden before and what it looks like now. So as I mentioned, the garden was at the site of the old Washington Park Zoo. And so you can see this is the bear den here. That's what this looked like in the late 1950s. This is what that spot looks like now. Yeah. Absolutely stunning. The waterfalls, all of our water features are man-made, but one of the signs of our success, and I love this, is when I'm out in the garden or giving a tour, I hear people ask the question, "Oh, is that waterfall real?" And I'm like, well, if they can't tell, we're doing our job really well, right? So, but they're all man-made. This spot here, so these were the old, they would hold the meats for the animals. They would store the meat in these old buildings that were refrigerated and such. And so this was that back in the when they were breaking ground and clearing the land for the garden, the original garden. This is what it looks like right now. You see transformations. The moon bridge, and I think the symbolism of bridging between countries and between peoples is really important one for Japanese gardens everywhere. But this was in the 1960s when they were building the moon bridge. Even before off to the side here is where a tea house is now. And this was even before they've started putting the tea house in. But this was our moon bridge in the 1960s. This is what it looks like today. This is literally what it looks like today because we're in October now and the leaves are all changing. So pretty remarkable transformation you can see where it looks like you could be in Kyoto. Actually, I have a great story. I was flying, let's see, it was about 10 years ago. I was flying from Japan to Vietnam for vacation. And I was on, I think it was Japan Airlines. And I sat down and I opened up the in-flight magazine, and it was an article, it was about 7 or 8 page article about advertising for people to come to Kyoto during the fall colors. And so I'm looking at this book and I'm like, oh, this is lovely. And, you know, the airline is promoting Japan and their gardens and everything. And then I opened up and there was a double page fold. And inside that double page fold, that caption said, come enjoy the fall colors here in Kyoto. And it was this picture of the Portland Japanese garden. And I'm like, okay, we've arrived. If even the Japanese can't tell that this is not Kyoto, we have arrived. So it was a great moment. So then I went on an entire airplane saying, oh, can I have that magazine? Can I have that magazine? And I collected them all and gave them to my whole board. So it was a great, great moment. So, and then in 2017, we began with the idea of doing an expansion, and we realized that our programs were growing and that we needed more space. And so this was our only maintenance facility at the time, and it was just this little A-frame garage building that was built in the 1990s. And then when I came and, you know, when I arrived, we had 17 staff members. And we started to grow because we needed to do more programs and fundraising and all of that. And so we didn't have the money to build any new buildings. And so we bought tough sheds. And we put up tough sheds, and these were staff offices. And people were working out of tough sheds. This was in the 2000s. And then this is that very spot today. Yeah. Remarkable transformations, right? Transformations. So what happened over time was that when I came in 2005, the garden, it was already recognized to be the finest, the most authentic Japanese garden outside of Japan. And so when I started looking at the job, it came to me the realization that it's the best at what it does in the world, but programmatically, organizationally, institutionally, it was completely undeveloped. That they were doing a couple programs, some tea ceremonies, the occasional, if the Japan Foundation had an exhibition, then they would take that exhibition and, you know, do an exhibition and such, but really they were not living up into the potential. And in fact, at that time, there were some conservative board members and members of the garden who didn't want more people coming to the garden, right? That more people would ruin their garden, and it was so precious to them, and it would become overrun. And so they had policies in place, for example, policies in place that would keep travel writers away. They did not want tourists coming to their garden. And if a travel writer came and wrote about the garden and put it in a magazine, then somebody might come and see their garden. So there was actually policies saying that if a travel writer could not spend at least, I think it was 6 hours in the garden, truly understanding the essence of the garden, well, then they were not welcome. They couldn't come, or at least they would not have the benefit of the staff, you know, helping them to learn and provide them whatever they needed on their stay. So things like that when it came into place, and you know, long conversations with the board in those early years about, well, we're a community organization, we're a nonprofit organization, we have a responsibility to our community, to serve our community, and that doesn't mean a small portion of our community, but how do we leverage this organization and this garden to do even more? So I hired our first curator of culture, art, and education, Diane Durston. She's a woman an author, scholar, who lived in Kyoto for 18 years. So understood the gardens of Japan, but also all of the crafts. There's the 7 Paths to the Old City Kyoto book that she wrote, which many of you, if you've been to Kyoto, probably that was your definitive guide in Kyoto, was her book. So we hired her. And with the goal of, I said, I want to use this garden as a platform for teaching many more things about Japan. And so your job is to do that. And once we began doing that, we began having these programs, people began to engage in a different way. And our membership began to grow, and our visitorship began to grow. And when we actually started cooperating with travel writers and with publications, even more people started to come, and we just started to see this incredible growth and need. It was just after that I hired our first garden curator, as I mentioned before, Sada Uchiyama, whose job was to oversee the artistic vision of the garden, as well as the day-to-day maintenance of the garden. So we had about 20 years of deferred maintenance in the garden at that time, because the organization was a little paralyzed. Number one, there was no fundraising program, so the organization had no money. But number two, there was nobody there to make decisions. There were board committees, but with a Japanese garden, I prefer that lawyers and bankers not be making design decisions within a Japanese garden, well-meaning as they may be. So having that garden curator come in and begin to make that change was also important. So over time, we began to grow, and then in 2017, after a couple of years of fundraising, we had really decided that we needed to do an expansion. We completed this project, which we called the Cultural Crossing Project, in which we hired Kengo Kuma, one of the most sought-after designers in the world, perhaps the most sought-after designer in Japan, to come and to design a new cultural village for us and to add 3 more garden spaces. And one of the reasons, if you look at this picture here, the reason I linger on this, one of the reasons that we hired Kuma-san was his philosophy around the integration of the built landscape and the natural landscape, right? And because the garden was so precious and it was only 5 acres, and we were going to be adding another 5 or 6 acres, we didn't want the built environment that we were about to expand to overwhelm the actual garden itself. So Kengo Kuma's philosophy is what he calls disappearing the building, right? How do you integrate the built landscape into the natural landscape to minimize the visual impact on the landscape? And so you can see here with these green roofs and how we integrated into the forest and cut down as few trees as possible. We were able to, I think, accomplish much of that. There's another great view from within the garden when you're standing on the moon bridge and looking back up from the other side of this, in which we were also worried from inside the garden, because this is the entry procedure. This is the entry to the garden. From inside the garden, where again, these buildings were looming so large that putting these green roofs on the buildings connected the green. So you, from the moon bridge now, the green is connected through these green roofs to the trees behind, and you can barely see that there's buildings there at all. It's pure genius. The design is absolutely spectacular. And again, with Kuma-san, just as Professor Tono did, Kuma-san said, no, we're not going to remove all these trees. We're going to leave them right where they are. We're going to work with them. We're going to work around them. And so got us a wonderful impact and effect that we were looking for. So when this opened, again, we had another explosion at the garden in terms of all the programs that we're doing, the people that were, they say, if you build it, they will come. Well, they came. And so what happened? Since 2005, we've seen our annual attendance go from 100,000 to 500,000 people a year. Our membership has grown from 3,000 to 27,000 members, now from all over the world. Our culture, art, and education programs, doing about 80 per year. We're now doing 300 to 350 programs per year. Our staff at that time was 17 full-time staff. We now have 150 full-time staff at the garden. And our annual budget grew from $1 million to $13 million. And since then, too, our endowment has grown from about $2 million to about $8 million as well. We need a $100 million endowment, but we're working on that. So we see that we had a lot of success here, and then also began to realize that we were already out of space, even after having done this $37 million expansion. There are a couple of reasons for that. One was that we came to realize that the field of Japanese gardens was not connected at all. In fact, that we had these 300 public Japanese gardens in North America. There were 400 in Europe, and there were 250 in South America, much less Asia, and that nobody was talking to each other, much less being connected to the field in Japan. And so all these gardens that were designed to be the epitome of Japanese design and culture and shining beacons of beauty actually were in disrepair, and they were, as I said, becoming Japanesey, and they were failing. So the problem being, if you have a Japanese garden in whatever community you're in and you want to learn these skills, there's a few people you can learn it from here in the United States, but mostly you have to go to Japan and you have to learn it. And in order to do that, you have to speak Japanese. And so most gardeners and landscape architects don't, in this country and around the world, don't speak Japanese, and the difficulty of learning the language. Number two is once you do go to, if you were to go to Japan, you have to find a sensei who would take you on for no less than 5 years of study, because then it would be worthless, of which the first 2 years are sweeping. And so the pedagogy around how they teach in Japan, these crafts are very different. And so if you can't speak Japanese and you can't take 5 years out of your life, how are you going to learn this stuff? And so we realized there was a need, number one, to connect the field, and then number two, to create a training program in which here in English in the United States, we could teach some of these skill sets. So we led the charge and worked with a leadership group of Japanese gardens in North America, and we created the North American Japanese Garden Association. And so that association now exists. It has over 400 members. We're doing every other year conferences, national conferences. We hosted the International Japanese Garden Conference in 2018. And then there's 4 regional workshops every year all across the United States, in which gardeners, whether you're a landscape architect, you work for a public garden, or you just want to improve your garden in your backyard, you can learn all of these skills and such. So once we created that network, then we began to build what we call the International Japanese Garden Training Center in Portland. So now we could take people from the field and from that association and feed them into an intensive training seminar program in which, in English, in America, in a 2-week intensive training seminar, you can take these classes and you can learn how to better maintain, design, and build your Japanese garden wherever you are in the world. I'm proud to say that the Kew Gardens, the largest, oldest, most famous botanical garden in the world, they now send their gardeners to us, and we train them on how to maintain their Japanese gardens in London. So this is really a great accomplishment so far as I'm concerned. So we realized that there was more work to be done, and there was great demand for the programs that we had, and that we were out of space. We also realized about the same time that we had a branding problem. That when you go around and you say, oh, hi, I'm Steve Bloom, I'm the CEO of the Portland Japanese Garden. Well, Portland Japanese Garden conjures up pretty much one thing in most people's minds. We are trees and bridges and koi. Isn't that lovely? But it didn't speak to the 300 to 350 culture, art, and education programs that we're doing every year, now on 6 continents, the likes of the Japan Society or the Asia Society in New York, but everyone just thought of us as a garden, right? And so we knew we had to fix that too, which is why we also came up with the idea of what we have now called the Japan Institute. And so the Japan Institute is the the programmatic arm of the garden. And so it consists of 3 different centers. Sorry, just watching my time because I will talk forever if so allowed. 3 different centers, and basically these are pots from which we do different programming. So I talked about the International Japanese Garden Training Center. So that teaches the hands-on construction, maintenance, and design and maintenance of Japanese gardens to designers from all over the world. We are coordinating with the Garden Society of Japan, which certifies Japanese gardeners in Japan so that the standards are the same. And so even though you have to take 6 years to learn it there, we're doing it over 3 years in an intensive training seminar program, but the standards are the same, so they'll tie together. So if you're certified by them or certified by us, it's the same certification. Down the road, we hope to offer a specialty or a master's in conjunction with a local university. So you can get your master's in landscape architecture with a specialty in Japanese gardens. So that would be in the future of the International Japanese Garden Training Center. The second center is the Global Center for Culture and Art. So this is much of the programming that we were doing before, the art exhibitions, the culinary programs, performing arts, things that we were doing in Portland, but trying to do a bit more with that. So instead of just, and I will say, we are not a museum. So we do not, exhibit works of art that are 1,000 years old and are priceless and all of that. So one of the great things about our organization, though, is that we work with living artists. And so we'll bring artists in and they can come for an exhibition, we'll exhibit their work. They do demonstrations, workshops, they interact with other artists when they come, with our members, they'll do demonstrations. And then we sell all of their artwork out of the exhibition. And 50% of the proceeds go to that artist and 50% come to us. So in the course of an 8-week exhibition, we might sell more artwork in 8 weeks for them than they'll sell an entire year in Japan, because we've become now this repository for great art, and people from all over the country know that they can come to Portland for our exhibitions, they can meet the artists, and they don't have to travel all the way to Japan and all that expense. And so we're building new collectors here in Japan as well. Well, we want to go a step further, and we want to do artist in residence programs where we can have an artist come for 6 weeks, 6 months, or a year and be in residence working with our artists in our region, but also across North America and around the world, to create new works of art that are inspired not only by Japan and through these arts and crafts of Japan, but that are inspired by the garden and by the Pacific Northwest. And then we want to take these and take all that resource that we have, the financial resource that we put into it, the intellectual resource, the human resource. And instead of that all going away after 8 or 12 weeks when the exhibition is done, we want to package that and say, okay, now we can send that to Louisville, Kentucky, or to Sao Paulo, Brazil, or to Paris, France. And we can work with like organizations around the world to help share the resource that we've connected. So making it a more global impact. And new commissions of performing arts. Kabuki. We're working with Shochiku. We brought them in 2017 to do their first ever work in a Japanese garden in North America. And they loved it so much that they're coming back and they want to do more. And they've asked us to help with connections so that they can do a West Coast tour while they're here. So working to help not just bring things to Portland, but help share the resource that we have with other parts of the world as well, with these different genres. So here's the Japanese Garden Training Center. Here you see our kabuki in the garden, and great story on this. We got real resistance from Shochiku to even come to Portland. It took me 2 years to convince them that they should come and they should do this. And so they finally sent this group, and the advanced crew came, and they had set all the requirements for, we need a stage, and we need a covering, and we need lights, and all of this stuff. And the actors showed up on the first day, and we had built this whole monster of a stage in the middle of our courtyard. And the actors had never been to the garden before. They walked around the courtyard and they looked at the stage, and then they looked at this garden in the back, and they're like, get rid of that stage. They said, we want this garden as the backdrop. And the actors absolutely loved it. Like I say, they love it so much that they all want to come back. And so we're working to bring kabuki back to the garden. So the Global Center for Culture and Art. And then the International Exchange Forum. International Exchange Forum is about conversations and dialogue around shared values and ideals that we have with Japan, lessons that we've learned from our relationship with Japan. So that can be across many different fields and ideas. So as I mentioned, we hosted the International Japanese Garden Conference in 2018, in which we brought from all over the world, the Garden Society of the UK, and from Europe, and from Denmark, and from Rio de Janeiro. They all came to Portland as a Japanese garden field for the first time ever, the largest conference ever held. In 2022, rescheduled from 2020, in 2022, we hosted the American Public Gardens National Conference. So now not just Japanese gardens, but 600 public gardens from 20 countries around the world came to Portland, and we hosted that conference, and we got to highlight Japanese gardens in front of the whole world of public gardens. And it was just an amazing experience and opportunity to promote Japan and put Japan out there in front. So things like that, but then also smaller conversations around design and environmental sustainability, the art of craft, and all of these things that we know and love and learn from Japan. I'm going to talk more about our signature International Exchange Forum program in a few minutes, but So we also came to realize that we didn't have enough space at the garden anymore. So we began to look for a new campus that would be close by, and I had a list of all the things that we needed in the campus, which was place for people to stay overnight, and artist studios, and administrative space, and performance space, and all this stuff. And in December of 2020 was the darkest hour of the pandemic. I don't know if you remember, but we were shut down again by the state. I just laid off 140 people again for the third time, and went down to zero revenue. Omicron was sweeping across the country. And I got a call from a real estate agent saying, I think I found a campus for you. And they brought me to this site, which was since 1914 owned by the Salvation Army. And it was a home for unwed mothers. So back in 1914 and through the decades that followed, of course, if you got pregnant out of wedlock, that was a shameful thing for your family. And you were sent away to Aunt Martha's to have the baby. And then when the baby was born, you would be sent back home. Well, this was Aunt Martha's, right? Right, hidden in Portland. And you'll see it's hidden in the forest. And that was deliberate, because they didn't want these young women to be seen either pregnant or with their children. So it's actually on the other side of a ravine, and it's at a dead-end road alongside Forest Park. And you drive to this dead-end road, and at the very end, there's a single lane bridge that takes you over to this campus that was just this hidden place. And it's an incredible place in that great work was being done there, and having these babies born and such, but really tough work was being done there too, right? These babies were being then taken from their mothers sent home, and then they were adopted, never to see their biological mother again. So when the site came up, number one, it ticked every box that we wanted in terms of a campus. Number two, the idea that we could take this place of such kind of pain and turmoil and turn it into this incubator for creating art and beauty through nature and gardens and artists and such, just inspired me to think, we need to do this. We need to buy this campus. So in the darkest month of the pandemic, I went to my board and I said, so I found this campus and I want to launch a $20 million capital campaign. And they, of course, looked at me like I was crazy for about 5 minutes. And then they gave the first $5 million to secure the property so that we could purchase it. So since then, we have purchased the property. We're in design to do a major renovation of it. The $20 million campaign has now turned into a $40 million campaign, but we've raised over $20 million now. We've raised $20,500,000 to date in the middle of a global pandemic, which I'm really proud of, because it's about hope and light, right? This whole project. So it will have a Japanese textile studio, ceramic studio, photography and digital art studio, a woodcraft studio, metalcraft studio, fine art studio, ikebana studio. It will have a commercial kitchen for a culinary program. It has a little theater, which we've engaged Kengo Kuma to design that little theater and to partner with Bullseye Glass in Portland. They're the largest art glass fabricator in the world, based in Portland. Owners happen to be on my board. So I put Kengo Kuma and Bullseye Glass together and said, take this little chapel and all these little stained glass windows and turn it into Kengo Kuma's first ever work in art glass. So it's going to be the crown jewel of the new campus when it's done. And then there will be a design center for architects and landscape architects with state-of-the-art AutoCAD design systems, with drawing and drafting tables, with a resource library. We have the second largest Japanese garden library in the world after Tokyo Agricultural University, most of which is in storage right now because the library at the garden is too small to house it all. So we'll have a place to put all that out there for students. Has a 22-bedroom residence hall, which is perfect size, all with private bathrooms. So we can house up to 44 people there. So if I want to bring the whole darn Kabuki theater crew over, we can do that, or gardeners from around the world, or artists, or scholars, or poets, or whoever we want to bring to come and meet and interchange, live on campus with these amazing artists and scholars from Japan. So that is happening. So $40 million, we're halfway there. Hopefully we'll have that rest of that raised by the end of next year. And we're hoping this campus will open the 1st of 2026, January of 2026 is our goal. So here you can see, we'll also have a bonsai garden, a Japanese garden, a sculpture garden, So gardens will also, we'll also have an artist in residence, I'm sorry, where is it? Yeah, artist in residence cottage here, so that if you want to come from Japan and live for 6 months or a year, but you don't want to leave your family, it's a 5-bedroom house you can live in and come and don't have to abandon your family for the year. And so I want to go back to that original gardener, Kinyahira, who came, the one who was stoned and stabbed by the crowd by that group in Portland who didn't want the garden, in opposition to those who did want the garden. And so he kind of said, you know, I'm never coming back to Portland after he left. And when I came in 2005, I realized we had him and all these other garden directors, and we had lost touch with most of them. They had gone on to do other things. And so I was going and meeting them. Every time I go back to Japan, I would find another one, and finally had met all of them. And I said, hey, I want to bring you all together in Portland at the same time. They had never even all been in the same room at the same time together. So I was able to convince everyone except for Hira-san. And he said, you know, I vowed I'd never return to Portland, and I have no desire to. And it took about a year of working with him and his daughters to convince him to come back. And we had a whole week full of events that week. And the gardeners walked with our volunteers and with our gardeners and told stories about, we built this here and what we did here and why we use that material there. And then we had a black tie fundraiser, $500 a person, and 500 people came to support, you know, and show their appreciation for the gardeners. And the whole week culminated in a panel discussion at the Portland Art Museum on the last day. And we brought in the director of the National Gallery of Art to moderate the conversation. And we had all these 8 former garden directors and our current garden curators sitting up there. And over 1,000 people showed up from the community to hear the story of this garden and how it was built. And this incredible thing happened. For Hira-san, he saw what this garden had become to the community. That in fact, now this garden was the crown jewel, the cultural jewel of the state of Oregon. And kind of all of his wounds were healed. And for me, it was this moment as a director of the organization, as a realization that the garden did its job, right? That this community that almost killed a man not wanting this garden in their community, in 2017 donated $37 million to double the size of it. And that's a pretty remarkable thing, that this slow and steady drip of culture, art, and nature can help to change attitudes about people. So instead about remembering about the wounds of the war and Pearl Harbor and that, what they do is they come and see this beauty and they think, who are the people that created such beauty? And I need to know more. And I want to start to peel back that onion. And so the garden is that opportunity to peel back that onion and to understand people, to see each other in a different way. And so our signature program right now for the International Exchange Forum is that we're doing 6 peace symposia on 6 continents. And we're going to tell our story with the hope that maybe we don't have the answers for everybody, but maybe there are pieces of our story that people can apply and use in their own situations, in their own communities around the world to provide more of a peace for whoever or wherever they are. So we were in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo last year to start our series of symposia. We were in London in December at the famous Guildhall, as you can see here, and 400 people showed up, and we worked with the Kew Gardens. And the director of the Kew Gardens said, you know, I never thought about my own institution in terms of how we could make a difference in peacemaking. He said, so I gathered my team, and we got together and we said, how can we look at hands-on solutions towards peacemaking through the work that we do here at the Kew Gardens, through food security, environmental sustainability, all of the things that we do. And so we adjusted our plan and the work that we do with an eye towards that. And you might think, well, okay, it's one garden. We made a little bit of a difference in London, except for that the Kew Gardens is doing work in 100 countries around the world. And so it's those things that we hope to just have the right person in the room to be able to make the difference. And so then we have gotten the attention of the Nobel Peace Center. And we're able to now shine a light on cultural diplomacy through the lens of Japan and the US-Japan relationship and partnership, and how far we've come from being the greatest enemies on the planet to the greatest friends on the planet. And even for the Nobel Peace Center, they are now working with us and collaborating on these symposia and other projects that we're doing. As a matter of fact, our keynote speaker for our gala on Saturday night was the director of the Nobel Peace Center, who came to talk about the importance of these gardens and this work. And so where do we go next? In December, we go to South Africa. And South Africa, this is amazing and important project for me in my heart as I've worked on it over the last year, because you see, South Africa is about the same amount of time after the end of apartheid as we were at the end of the war when the garden was created. And there's so many issues in South Africa, but the people are amazing to meet every single person there, whether black, white, rich, poor, Catholic, Jewish, gay, straight. They're all amazing people. And they all have one thing in common, which is that they're so proud to be South African, but they need to come to see each other in a different way. And so we're going down there and we're going to tell our story. And again, we may not have any answers for them, but if we can start to plant some seeds, and these kids that are from the born free generation after the end of apartheid, they never lived through apartheid. But in the generation under apartheid, the unemployment rate is 70% in that country. And they're looking for a path forward and hope. And everyone's pointing fingers at everybody else, which isn't very productive, is it? And so what we're coming down there to say is, hey, through culture, through art, through nature, that we can see each other's humanity in a different way and maybe come together in a different way. And that's our hope for these kids and why we're going down there to do that. So thank you very much. I hope you'll all have a chance to come up to Portland and see us, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
We now have a few minutes for some Q&A. I'm going to start off and just ask you, a bit about, there's a Japanese garden in Golden Gate Park here, and there are other ones around the area. What is your connection to, some of the, Japanese gardens here in the San Francisco area, and how can people get involved with, Japanese gardens generally if they aren't already active?
So I would say we do have relationships with some of the gardens here. As a matter of fact, I was supposed to go yesterday to see the work that's being done in Golden Gate Park. I've been to the garden before, but I know there's changes and restoration going on there. Our schedule got kind of screwed up. I didn't make it, but we'll get over there. But the Hakone Garden, for example, is a great example of a garden that's come a long way, and they're really making efforts to improve the maintenance and such, and with a new master plan that they're working to fund. And so they've done a lot of good work. So across California, because of this connection to Japan, there's so many Japanese gardens in California. So we continue to work and invite people up to participate in the training center. I think that's one way. But you in your own communities, go and volunteer and do what you can. Also, we need money. All gardens need money. It takes an investment. And I think the challenge sometimes in fundraising in Japan is, and in Japanese culture, is it's not as much part of the culture. And everyone expects that it's someone else's job to give the money and to do that or to volunteer. And I say all the time when I speak on philanthropy and volunteerism in Japan, I say it starts with you. And it's not someone else's job. It's your job first, and you lead by example, and then others will follow. So get out there and volunteer, make a donation, and it doesn't have to be $1 million donation. You got an extra $10 to give? I'll tell you, they'll put that $10 to good work. You'll feed that koi for a month with that $10, right? So now it's a UNICEF commercial.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is, first of all, that's a really good presentation. And one of the things I was wanting to talk about is this idea that of peace, but also of like the greenery and bringing in like more Japanese aesthetic, or people that understand how to prune and do these things. I know in the city here, we have very few people that know how to prune trees, at least that work for the city. And it's become quite a big problem because we have trees that fall down because they only cut half of them off. I mean, so is there a center that might be able to like train more people to prune better?
Yeah, absolutely. The technical expertise issue is a big one. It's why we created the Japanese Garden Training Center and why we created the North American Japanese Garden Association was because we're doing these regional workshops and we're bringing in the opportunity for people to learn hands-on how to do this. So we're going to continue to expand that. We invite you to come up and participate, but we also understand, like if you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s, there were the whole generation of Japanese immigrants who came in, and they were mostly working on maintaining these trees and these gardens and these yards. Of course, that's not the case anymore. They've moved on to become doctors and lawyers and, high tech, billionaires and such. So who are taking care of our landscapes today? It's mostly a Spanish-speaking community. So we're also in the process of creating a Spanish language track training program for pruning and for maintenance, so that the people who are actually doing the work can understand and be trained in how to perfect their art form as well. So a few things going on. Yeah, it's a never-ending battle though. So.
Steve, we did have a question from online. Somebody had asked about, you mentioned bonsai garden as being part of the new facility, and they had wondered how that's going to relate to the existing bonsai garden and elements in the PJ.
In the garden, yeah. The garden, bonsai garden that we have now, I think we exhibit around 14 trees at a time. We do not have our own collection because we have nowhere to keep it, to maintain it, and such. And so with the new campus, we'll now have a facility to be able to begin to have our own collection. We can maintain it. We can move trees in and out, whether they need maintenance or based on the weather or disease or whatever. We just don't have the facility right now. We have an abundance of riches of talent in bonsai in the Pacific Northwest. So we're very lucky. And all of those artists, those practitioners, they loan those trees to us. So we don't pay for them, but they loan them to us. And that tree, for that practitioner, for that artist that might sit in their backyard in which their family enjoys it, now 500,000 people a year get to enjoy that tree that artist worked so hard on. So we work with the bonsai community in the Pacific Northwest. We'll continue to do that. But now we're going to be able to have a facility where we can own our own collection.
Great. John, do you have we'll turn the question around. Yeah, here we go.
Okay. Steve, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned early on about the wisdom and vision of the founders of the Portland Garden and how they set up the governance to be really successful. Mm-hmm. And I wondered how the garden fits in with the Hoyt Arboretum and some of the surrounding properties there in Portland. And then what you know about how the governance is set up for the Japanese garden in Golden Gate Park, if you know anything about that and if there are any suggestions there. And then third, do you have any relationship with one of the tea ceremony groups in Japan, what to use and program in your Japanese tea garden?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Last one, the tea. Yes, so we work with a couple of the tea schools in Japan. We have not aligned ourselves with one school or another, but rather we're a place for all people and such. So we bring masters in from Japan. We also have our own schools, of those, chapters of those schools in Portland that we work with to do demonstrations. So we decided a long time ago that we weren't going to land on, Urasenke or Omotesenke, or, that we were going to be open for everybody in the garden. What was the next
governance?
Governance. Yeah, so as it pertains to within Washington Park and Hoyt Arboretum, they are also a nonprofit organization. They're getting ready to have a new capital campaign for a visitor center there as well. We have what we call these friends groups with the Portland Parks, with the city of Portland. And so that's our relationship with them. Because our relationship from that standpoint is the longest the city has. We have lots of things that are grandfathered in that we're very grateful for. So, for example, the Chinese garden or the Hoyt Arboretum, each of them, some of them have to pay rent to the city because it's city land and the city needs the revenue and all of that. We are fortunate that we have a $1 a year lease, 50-year lease. We're now on our second 50-year lease for $1 a year, and knowing that what we contribute to tourism, we're the #1 tourist attraction in the city of Portland. We're the #1 Uber and Lyft drop-off spot in the city of Portland. So we provide a lot to the city that way, and their way of contributing is to say, hey, and they leave us alone for the most part. They let us operate. We have to still work with the city zoning when we do expansion and construction and all that. But for the most part, they just leave us alone. Depending on the nonprofit friend, that Parks treats everybody differently and depends on their history and all of that. So for example, we get to decide our own admissions in terms of what we charge, and we get to keep it all. The Chinese Garden, they have to get city council approval to raise the cost of admission. So it's a little more challenging, but they came along, 30 years later after we did. So, and as far as Golden Gate Park, I don't know what the setup is there, unfortunately.
There'd be a model to turn it into something.
Yeah, and we do a lot of consulting with gardens around the country in terms of, hey, this is who we are and how it works. It might or might not work, but there might be pieces, that work for you. Seattle has just gone through a process in which they were part of the city, and they got a bequest from a donor, which gave them the resources to be able to roll off as a separate nonprofit. And so, I've been consulting with them through that whole process in terms of things to think about as they do that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Steve, there's another question, a quick one from online. Somebody wants to know where they can see a list of the 300 or 400 public Japanese gardens in the US and how they can get access to that.
Yeah, if you go to the North American Japanese Garden Association website, there was another organization that was keeping that list, and we actually merged with them a couple of years ago and took on that list and over that list. So I can't tell you exactly what tab to click on to find that, but the NAJGA.com, I think is, and North American Japanese Garden Association, NAJGA.
Great, thanks.
It's a mouthful.
Another question. Yes.
Inspiring presentation. Just a quick question. Back in 2005, what drove you to become the CEO of this garden?
Yeah. So I was living in Honolulu at the time as president of the Honolulu Symphony. I logically started my career as a symphony orchestra conductor, and that's how I ended up running my Japanese garden. I think that's the path most garden directors take. So, so no, I am. So as president of the symphony there, the chairman of Sony, Oga-san, and the widow of the founder of Sony, Mrs. Morita, they were donors of ours, and so. I had invited Mr. Oga, who was a conductor also, to come and conduct the Honolulu Symphony. So over the couple of years, they became friends, of mine. And so in 2002, they invited me to come to Japan for the first time. And I just had never seen such a place. I was just so taken with it. 105 times later, last weekend, I came back from Japan. It was my 105th trip to Japan. So Japan has become my passion in my life. When I had just burned out of the symphony orchestra business and the constant financial struggles, and I didn't like the constant clashing with the union, and just not in my personality. And so, and I'm the whitest person on the face of the earth, so the son of Hawaii was not something that was good to me. So I don't know how to swim, I don't play golf, and I can't be in the sun. So all the reasons everyone loves Hawaii were kind of lost on me, right? So I actually left not knowing where I was going to go or what I was going to do. My brother lived in Portland at the time, and I thought, well, it'd be cool if I could do something associated with Japan. I called my brother and said, hey, I gave 6 months notice, I'm leaving the symphony. Don't know what I'm going to do, but could you send me, this is telling my age now, could you send me the Sunday classified ads so I could look at the job postings in there? And the first weekend he sent the newspaper, this job was in there. And I had never been, even though I'd been to Portland many times, never heard of it. But as I started researching, as I said earlier, it became clear the product was already the best in the world, but nobody knew about it. And they weren't utilizing it as a platform, they weren't maximizing it. And so that to me was like really appealing. So in the interview process, I had a million questions of, well, what does running a symphony orchestra have to do with running a garden? So anyway, 18 years later, they can't get rid of me. Yeah. Oh, it has everything to do with running, because they weren't hiring me to prune, but fundraising, strategic planning, board development, marketing, all that stuff. And, you could put me in a museum, a ballet, a symphony, a garden. So much of those, are exactly the same. And for me, I was 17 years in that industry. I've been 18 in this. It was an opportunity to learn an entire different thing in my life, to basically 2 careers, to be a great musician and then to become this Japanophile, right? And so it's been the opportunity of a lifetime. Both careers were just opportunities of a lifetime at the time.
Yes. We're from the East Bay and we have a Japanese garden in Hayward. And it's a small garden and it's run by the Recreation Department, Park and Recreation. You may have them on your list, I don't know. But if they wanted to improve the garden and expand the garden, what would you recommend as a series of initial steps for that?
So you're talking about the physical expansion of the garden, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So what I would say.
Would expand also with that plans,
Yeah.
design.
So what I would say is you always need a plan, right? You need to have a vision for what you want to accomplish in a plan, because you can go out, because then it's going to take money, right? And it's going to take interested people who are going to push this idea forward for you, and passionate advocates and ambassadors for what you want to do. But you can't sit across from someone and not have a plan and expect them to care about it or invest in it. So whatever it is you want to do, you have to sit with the stakeholders who really want it to happen, and you have to have a clear plan for what it is, and a shared plan, a shared vision for what it be. Because if you have 6 people who all want to do something else, again, you're not going to get anywhere. So creating a shared vision for what you want to accomplish and putting a plan together, and then building a team and the organizational capacity to make that happen, to raise the money, to find the technical expertise, to find that designer who's going to design the expansion. All of those are pieces you have to consider. But without a plan, it's like without a roadmap, you're just going to end up in the river. So, yeah.
Yeah, by the city, I think it has to start there. City plan.
Yeah, so she was just mentioning that if it's public gardens, then of course it would owned by the city, that you would have to start with the city.
It's a separate unit.
Yeah, so it's a separate unit connected to the city. So when I talked about bringing stakeholders together, the city's one of those stakeholders. They're a really important stakeholder, right? So they need to be at the table and they need to be part of that shared vision.
Maybe this will be our last question before we move to wrap up some of the section. Yes.
I was wondering, do you have like a Japanese vegetable garden section there? Because that's all I plant is Japanese vegetables. I don't know if you're familiar with the Kisakawa Seed Company. It's the oldest seed company in the country. And it's in Oakland and they have the best seeds. So I was wondering if you would ever think about a vegetable garden.
So I'll first, just disclaimer, I hate eggplants. And it's really hard traveling in Japan because everything has natsu on it, right? So it's like, oh my gosh. We don't, because that's not the kind of gardening we're in. That being said, with the new campus, the plan is eventually to have a culinary program, and that we would have some beds there to plant some things there. But we're, several years away from that. We're just not there. So, yeah. So, there's an abundance of things that we could be doing, but it takes time to ramp that up, number one, but it also takes money. And, so everything in its time. It's not like in 2026, boom, it's going to be just like, it's going to be a 10-year ramping up to, get that campus doing and maximizing its potential as well.
So Steve, I actually have a question that I wanted to ask as sort of a final question. And that is, a lot of times, we here in the States, we look at Japan and say, oh, great temples, great history, great gardens. We kind of look to them as a, kind of a source of inspiration and kind of the original of whatever cultural item there happens to be. it seems like Portland Japan Garden has gotten to the place where perhaps you have some influence on Japan. And I know that your team members are actually here from Japan. Do you want to tell us a little bit? I don't know if you'd like to share kind of either what your vision is or how you think Portland Japan Garden has had some impact on gardens in Japan.
Our relationship with Japan is give and take, right? And it never should just be one direction. It's always give and take. And we understand that, you know, they are the birthplace of this art form and all of these art forms. At the same time, we view them through a different lens, and we can be a voice for them in a way that a lot in Japan can't be. One of the things we know about Japanese culture is that they're a humble people and they're not a boastful people. Well, we can brag about all these wonderful things about Japan, both in Japan and outside of Japan, in a way that many Japanese wouldn't do for themselves. We also, you know, the ideals of sponsorship, of membership, of volunteerism, of philanthropy. We in the United States do that really, really well, right? It's just in our blood. And so I speak a lot on philanthropy and volunteerism in Japan because they want to know, but they can't figure out how to do it, right? And so, so I go and I talk a lot about that, and I think that's one way that we give back. But even on the garden side, we worked starting 10 years ago with the Tokyo Metropolitan Garden Association, which is the 13 major public gardens in the city of Tokyo, because they were gardens and places to visit, but they wanted to know more about how do we utilize our gardens? How do we do ikebana exhibitions and otsukimi? You know, people in Japan, young people, they've never been to otsukimi. I go every year, you know, and I'm here in Portland, Oregon. So helping gardens there also to learn how to program their gardens, how to maximize the use of their gardens. And then the cross-pollination of ideas, and that goes in both directions. So Misako Ito and Hiroshi Furusawa, they're two of my 3 staff that I have in Japan. We just opened an office in Tokyo last year, and this last month, established ourselves as a nonprofit in Japan so that we can do more of that back and forth over time.
Great. Yeah. Great. Well, let's all put our hands together and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Building bridges between the United States and Japan since 1905. Japan Society.